Joining me first on today's episode is John Thull from the University of Minnesota. John specializes in grape breeding and enology with a focus on cold climate grapes and wine. So welcome, John. Thanks for being on the podcast today.
Hey, Fritz. Thanks for having me, for sure.
Yep, you got it, man. You got it. We've known each other for a little while now. I've been out to the American Society of Enology and Viticulture Eastern Section Conference that was in Minnesota not long ago. And you did a walk through the breeding program there. Really, really interesting to see what you've got going on there. So I definitely want to dig into that a little bit today, as well as what you're going to teach us about your pruning practices. But before we talk about cold climate strategies for pruning, can you tell the listeners just a little bit more about yourself and how you got involved in this program?
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in Minnesota, central Minnesota, and I was always interested in the wild grapevines growing around the farm as a kid. And that sort of led me on a path that brought me through, a biology degree with a plant focus. And after I got done with college, I thought maybe there's a place that I could really learn about this grape growing business, And I found a way to go to Germany and work there for an entire season and do basically an apprenticeship on the Mosel. And that was the most eye-opening thing in my entire life, as far as like, wow, this is what they really do, and as far as growing grapes and making wine. So that was really impressive for me. And when I got done with that little stint, I came back to Minnesota, and I knew there was something going on as far as grapes and the university and maybe breeding. I just didn't know what it was. So I essentially inserted myself into the program by saying I could volunteer for you guys for free at least, and see what.
Oh, nice.
See how
nice.
And they said, well, yeah, come on, and maybe we'll even hire you. So it's been 18 seasons later, and I'm still here. So love it, man.
Let's talk a little bit about the breeding program. And Minnesota's famous for having produced some new cultivars of grapes that are very, very cold hardy. And so I want to touch on that because you don't hear about Minnesota Merlot very often. So why is that?
Oh, right. If you did want to grow Merlot here, you'd have to cover it with straw or soil, like you would be burying some precious roses, for example, and just to get it to survive our winter, because our winters are so harsh that a lot of the vinifera types of grape do not survive Minnesota's winters. So what that ends up meaning is we do have a wild grape species that lives in Minnesota and throughout much of the United States, actually. It's called the Vitis riparia. So that has been mainly the basis for a lot of our cold hardy genetics in our program, and has led to varieties such as Frontenac, Marquette, La Crescent, more currently Itasca and Clarion. So there's a whole host of varieties that are cold hardy, and it's not even just the University of Minnesota. There's other private breeders that are out there that are producing some new cold hardy cultivars, it's pretty exciting time for us in the colder zone.
Yeah, no, I've tasted wines from many of the varieties you've mentioned, and they have great potential and are making already outstanding wines, in my opinion. But just for the listener here, how cold does it get in your vineyards in Minnesota, and how cold hardy? I mean, to put it in perspective, we'll talk Fahrenheit here. How cold does it get, and how cold will these varieties survive down to?
Yeah, well, if you would have asked me last year, our cold temperature was actually fairly mild for us. So we barely dipped into the minus 20s. Minus 25 was about the extent of it. And so that was tropically warm for us almost. Typically,
right.
You will see a lot of minus 30, minus 35 Fahrenheit. And in the northern part of the state of Minnesota, where you really wouldn't be growing grapes, you'll get down to minus 40, possibly minus 50. I know there's some pretty good cold record-breaking temperatures up in the northern part of the Minnesota, but most of the grape growing is relegated to central and southern Minnesota anyway.
I was going to say, well, when you have a spur, you have the 1-year-old fruitful wood, which is what you're pruning back to your 1 or 2 or maybe 3 buds, whatever your system is. But then you have the interface of the 1-year and 2-year-old wood, where you have that old crown or ring of latent or dormant buds. And then you have another one of those where the 2-year-old wood meets the 3-year-old wood. So there's I can see what you're saying. There's always maybe a backup latent bud that's going to push in a worst case scenario. And you may not have fruit on that position for the season, but at least you're not losing your spur position. You're still growing something there to renew it. So I think it's good to walk through that and understand the different age wood and where they contact. There's a lot of buds potentially in those areas.
Yes. We're always like pruning so that we have backups to the backup to the backup. And, you always have this like fear, like, oh, I just got to leave some insurance. I always call it like insurance buds on the vine, just to make sure that it can insure a crop coming forward. And that's the trickiest part. And it differs depending on variety for sure. So some varieties are more bulletproof and they will fruit really nicely on canes and reliably from year to year. Itasca is a great, reliable cane fruiting. You can prune cane Itasca and pretty much rely on that fruit coming through from year to year. So I do like that one for cane pruning. But a guy like Marquette is a little bit more sensitive. Some years the canes are perfect. Like when it's a mild winter, yeah, go ahead, do a little cane pruning or fix up those crummy cordons that are starting to fail, that are starting to accumulate a little bit too much winter injury over the seasons. You can lay down a new cane in that kind of a season like last year where it was not so cold. But you don't want to dare rely on cane pruning, especially if we've dipped into one of our colder seasons, because that following season, you'll end up, the foundation that you build for a brand new cordon will be already compromised. And yeah, you don't want to have to do that.
So how do you approach getting your bud numbers up without causing a total imbalance on the vine with apical dominance and other crowding issues?
Well, what we basically do is what we call like spare parts pruning or dirty pruning to some extent, where you are leaving a few more buds than you would anticipate that you would really want, just to get you over that hump of the cold season and into the spring. And then you kind of rely on shoot thinning as soon as things start getting going to thin off those extra buds. So yeah, we are leaving a few more spurs sometimes in that same foot spacing than you would typically do with more moderate climate. And that does that helps us ensure that we do have the shoots that we want. But the issue is, I think, and I know growers know this, and labor shortages are always, it's a pinch point, because who's going to be able to have time to go back and really shoot thin that vine properly the way it should be or the way it wants to be. So I always find myself I just still prune fairly tight and hope for the best. And I know what varieties I'm working with when I'm using these different strategies. So for example, the Frontenac family of grapes. So we got Frontenac and the Frontenac Gris color mutation, as well as Blanc, Frontenac Blanc. Those all tend to come to the winter really, really, really well. So we can trust that the way we prune those guys, you're typically going to get those buds to come, no issue.